Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and you know what time it is. In continuing our predictions / wishlists video for the Slaanesh DLC of 2025, we'll be turning our attention to other factions that could potentially arrive to face off with the Servants of the Dark Prince. And I called all three factions an Omen of Destruction long before that was announced, so I like to think I'm pretty decent at this guessing game. One faction that much of the community seems to agree is a likely candidate for the Slaanesh DLC is, of course, the noble High Elves of Ulthuan. After all, the Asur debatably have the greatest rivalry with the god of excess. I personally agree that they're extremely likely to join the roster, so why don't we dive into what might be awaiting us with the glittering host. Before we sail into Lothern's beauteous port, there is a rather unusual issue here that needs to be addressed. When looking at the options for what could be brought to the High Elves in regards to subfactions, so to speak, the only thing they're really missing is the Sea Patrol from the Storm of Chaos. That faction is led by Sea Lord Aislinn, who I'll be discussing at length in just a bit. Despite being quite a popular character with some fun lore snippets, Aislinn has never actually been a playable character. No known magic items, special rules, stats, etc. This itself isn't a death sentence though, as Nakai was in a fairly similar boat, with just a Games Workshop summer event printing a page of rules which was mostly considered unofficial. Just something worth pointing out, but without further ado, let's get into it. For the High Elf Legendary Lord of the Slaanesh DLC, I believe we'll receive the infamous Master of the Waves, Sea Lord Aislinn. Aislinn has been one of the greatest admirals among the Asur for centuries, known for his pernicious nature and extreme acts of violence against those who earn his ire. While many elves are known to look down on other species from their ivory towers, the Admiral seems to deeply despise the lesser races, particularly humans and halflings, often going out of his way to make bloody examples of any that step out of line by interfering with elven affairs. When it comes to lore, Aislinn makes his debut in 2181 of the Imperial Calendar, which is a little less than 300 years ago from the era of Karl Franz, with his timely arrival in the Old World to aid none other than King Grundidrak of Barak Var against Wa Gutrippa. The Orc war boss had effectively taken over the shoreline of the Black Gulf, causing considerable issues for naval trade in the region. The Sea Patrol joined alongside the brave Dawi to form an unstoppable force that swept aside the Greenskins, though the alliance proved short-lived, as insults both intended and accidental left dwarfs grumbling over fresh grudges and elves bemoaning uncivilized habits. The Sea Lord would fade back into defending Ulthuan shores from invaders and patrolling the world-spanning ocean routes dominated by the Asur, when the most defining moment of his career would strike. Nearly half a century after the Great War against Chaos came to a close, one Captain Otto Steinroth, the infamous Red Pirate of Marienburg, somehow managed to lead a powerful fleet through the shifting isles guarding the eastern shores of Ulthuan. This act of sheer dumb luck allowed him to sack the city of Sardineth, slaughtering many of its citizens and sailing back to Marienburg with holds full of elven treasures. Word swiftly reached the Sea Lord about the attack, the news sending Aislinn into an absolute rage. With the unmatched swiftness possessed by High Elf ships, he could have easily caught the pirate fleet in open waters and crushed them. But the Admiral decided the time had come to remind humanity of their place. For too long, the upstart race of men had expanded their reach across the world with impunity. They needed a reminder of who owned the seas. Aboard his immense flagship, the Brine Dragon, Aislinn's fleet quickly tracked down Steinroth's ships. At this point, he signaled for his legendary sea mages, known as Mistweavers, to unleash their magic. These wizards specialize in summoning forth an immense wall of mist that blocks sight and drowns everything in thick, swirling clouds of white. The Sea Lord is a master of maneuvering within the mist, able to stealthily approach and ambush any potential foe. Thus did the Red Pirate fail to notice his pursuers for the entirety of his voyage, berthing at Marienburg's Gilderveld docks, believing he had escaped retribution. It was at that moment the seemingly distant blob of sea fog surged forward to eerily cover the sprawling port city. The experienced gunners of Marienburg, all veterans of countless attempted assaults by Norskins, Bretonnians, and Greenskins, peered from countless towers in a vain attempt to identify the source of the strange weather. Between their superhuman senses and skillful centuries of navigating the summoned mist, the Asur had no such issues, and guided effortlessly into a blockade formation. As the brine dragon surged towards the docks, the remainder of the Sea Patrol unleashed bombardments with eagle claw bolt throwers and sorcery. Aislinn's flagship sailed full into the harbor, the sleek dragon ship gliding to a flawless halt just as it disgorged hundreds of elven warriors along the dockside. The pirates of Steinroth attempted to defend their vessels, aided by the confused defenders of Marienburg who didn't understand why elves marched through their streets, but intended to protect their homes regardless. With the swirling mist granting them the edge, the Asur claimed an early advantage in the battle. Keen elven eyes easily found targets for their arrows, while the humans struggled to fend off expertly maintained spear walls. The situation quickly became too much for the Red Pirates' men, as they had little taste for fighting on the losing side. When Steinroth himself was cut down by Sea Lord Aislinn's longsword, the curs could take no more and fled. Leaping from the docks into the water or sprinting for the fires consuming entire portions of Marienburg, not a single one escaped, as white-fletched arrows found their marks. Those remaining men from Nordland and the Wasteland, focused on defending their homes, continued to fight, though they did so in vain. The veteran Lothern Sea Guard swiftly formed a defensive ring around the quayside, while other elves boarded the wolf prows and retrieved all of the truly valuable goods stolen from Ulthuan. With the last treasures brought aboard, Aislinn gave the command to his soldiers for an organized retreat to the Brine Dragon. The elves took with them not only their dead, but also many loudly protesting merchants who were forced to abandon their wares and shops. The Sea Lord would not allow any elf to remain behind as a potential scapegoat within Marienburg. As the flagship rejoined the rest of the fleet, Aislinn turned to consider the squalid city for a moment, before giving a nod to his assembled mages. They called down a conflagration of living flame upon the dockside. It greedily consumed every ship, jetty, and warehouse with horrific speed. By the time the Sea Patrol reached the open sea, the entirety of Marienburg's merchant fleet and much of the city's wealth had been reduced to ash on the wind. When Sea Lord Aislinn returned to Ulthuan, his reception was mixed, to say the least. While the princes of Sardaneth were deeply grateful to have their treasures returned and vengeance satisfied, the far more numerous families who had trade agreements with Marienburg were enraged. The vast majority of the Phoenix Court decried the Admiral's actions as needlessly ruthless, and practically an open declaration of war on what should have been an ally. In the coming months, Aislinn's standing at court diminished to almost nothing. This wasn't helped by his apparent response to the situation of launching fresh campaigns of reciprocity against Norscan settlements, killing more and more humans. Ironically, the very actions that isolated him from most of his peers among the nobility drew Aislinn closer to the Phoenix King, for Finnabar saw in the Sea Lord's ruthlessness a tool that Ulthuan could not afford to lose. Sea Lord Aislinn would carry on dominating the seas for several more decades. His refusal to utilize mercy showcasing his dedication to Mathlan, the elven god of the sea. Any vessel's crew would feel the cold brush of fear upon seeing his fleet emerging from the conjured mists. However, Aislinn was not the only elf upon the seas who inspired terror in his enemies. Long had the Sea Lord been aware of his greatest rival, the wretched Druki named Lokir Fellheart. The Kraken Lord had slaughtered his way across the great ocean countless times, including a devastating attack upon the High Elven colony of Tor Elisor. For many years, these two champions of Mathlan had sought the chance to see who would prove superior, the opportunity finally arriving in 2417 of the Imperial calendar, about 100 years before the start of the era of Karl Franz. Sea Lord Aislinn had at last tracked down his ultimate quarry, shadowing the infamous Black Ark known as the Blessed Dread across the Sea of Serpents. Putting his trust in the conjured mist that had seen him to victory for centuries, Aislinn made a terrible error. For Lokir Fellheart knew well that some force had been stealthily following him, carefully watching the waves themselves for disturbances that no mist could hide. When the Sea Patrol launched their attack, the Kraken Lord was ready, with counter after counter. Immense sea monsters, suicidal assassins, and powerful sorcery were all unleashed to isolate the Sea Lord's new flagship, the Caradryan, from the remainder of his fleet. With his sails torn apart and the Blessed Dread bearing down upon him, Aislinn prepared what remained of his crew to sell their lives dearly. The boarding action that followed was an absolute bloodbath. Swarms of corsairs, led by Lokir himself, stormed the Caradryan with practiced lethality. Lothern Seaguard fought to the bitter end against superior numbers, while the White Lions of Thrace strove to protect the Sea Lord at all costs. Little by little, Aislinn's warriors were whittled away until only the Admiral himself remained. The rest of his fleet had been torn apart by roaring Helldrakes and nimble Doomreaver ships, the Sea Patrol floundering without their lord's guidance against the tactics of Fellheart. Before any could claim the kill, the Kraken Lord shouted that Aislinn was his quarry, a ring forming around the two elves. Their duel was that of legend. For over an hour, Aislinn and Lokir fought in a display of martial prowess no human eye could hope to follow. Even as the Caradryan caught ablaze, neither paid any heed, so focused were they upon claiming this victory. A chance to humiliate an ultimate rival eclipsed the naval engagement as the only conflict that mattered, both warriors utilizing every feint and strike they knew. The contest remained even, until at last Aislinn struck one of Lokir's red blades from his hand. The Kraken Lord laughed in response, the sword's magic returning it to his outstretched hand a moment later. His return double swing nearly swept the Sea Lord into the crashing waves below, but Aislinn managed to keep his footing. He brought his longsword down with a double-handed grip, channeling all his strength into the blow. The blade cleaved through the Kraken helm and deep into the skull beneath it. Yet even as it ripped free, the wound instantly regenerated, as if it had never been, and even the helm's metal rippled back together. Undaunted, the Sea Lord swung down once more with such force that his blade shattered into 3 pieces, though he at least had the satisfaction of sending Fellheart knocked sprawling to the ground. Sweeping up a fallen White Lion's great axe and surging forward to decapitate his monstrous foe, Aislinn could feel in the depths of his soul that this would be the final blow. He was right, but unfortunately not in the way that he thought. Lokir slashed out with one of his swords, hamstringing the nearest corsair and casting the wretch into the Sea Lord's path. Aislinn cleaved the elf even as he stumbled, surprised by the cowardly tactic, but the Kraken Lord left no time to recover. Whirling the red blades to knock aside the axe, Felhart plunged both of his glowing blades up to the hilt into Aislinn's chest. He crowed with victory as his opponent dropped his weapon with nerveless fingers, before using one foot to shove the Asur admiral off his weapons and over the gunwale into the sea below. So fell Sea Lord Aislinn, lost to the depths of the sea, along with his entire fleet. The Blessed Dread sailed away towards the horizon, leaving no survivors. Yet, that is not where our story ends. 6 months later, Aislinn's body washed up upon the shores of Etain. Miraculously, not only was he still alive, but apparently healed, for not even scars remained from his climactic duel. The Sea Lord had no explanation for his survival, claiming that he had no memory of the months since he had gone missing. From that moment on, Aislinn has been hailed as the Herald of Mathlon, for surely only the Lord of the Deeps could have delivered him from such a watery grave. After this point, Sea Lord Aislinn's story splits, depending on which timeline one chooses to follow. During the Storm of Chaos, he would play a critical role in hamstringing Archaon's efforts to destroy the Empire by leading a brutal hit-and-run campaign along the southern coast of Norska. Refusing to explain his goals to anyone, including the Phoenix King himself, the Sea Lord managed to make waves by rescuing prisoners, securing artifacts, and assassinating leaders of the Chaos Hordes wherever possible. His reputation for delighting in cruelty only grew, notably when having his Stormweavers utilize their mist conjuring so that his bolt throwers and archers could massacre settlements at range without them even realizing they were under attack. Beyond being a notable nuisance, however, he played quite a minor role in the overall campaign. The end times proved to be much worse for the Admiral. Sea Lord Aislinn fought a difficult series of naval battles in the absolute madness that was the war on Ulthuan between the High Elves and Dark Elves, before things shifted as Tyrion drew the Sword of Cain. When the Elves fractured along the new lines of whether to support Tyrion or Malekith, Aislinn appeared to take the side of Tyrion, until at the opportune moment he betrayed the followers of Cain as Malekith's allies made for the Isle of the Dead in the center of Ulthuan. Captured alive and dragged before the avatar of Cain, Morathi, and his old rival Lokir Felhart, a brief exchange happened between them, before Aislinn revealed that he was essentially the mortal incarnation of Mathlon, and bore his favor. When Tyrion killed him, the Sea Lord unleashed the full wrath of the sea upon the Cainites, drowning the majority of Tyrion's fleet and granting Malekith's forces critical time to unbind the vortex. Thus did Sea Lord Aislinn finally meet his true death. So, all that to say that Aislinn appears to be an individual like Lord Daith of Athelloren, being a god of the Elven pantheon who took on a mortal elf form. It's not 100% clear whether Aislinn had always contained the essence within him, or if Mathlan simply possessed his body after he was seemingly slain by Lokir Felhart back in 2417 of the Imperial calendar. Based on how he acts and speaks about it, it appears, in my opinion, that Aislinn always had Mathlan's essence within him and didn't change in any notable way after that particular incident. Or perhaps Mathlan genuinely just saved him, healed him, nursed him back to health, and then returned him to Ulthuan. So, what I mean by that is it's not just Mathlan as a different entity wearing Aislinn like a skin suit. It is the actual High Elf character Aislinn as opposed to a facade. Looking at you, Sigmar. That brings us to the end of the lore segment on Sea Lord Aislinn, which means that it's time to discuss the character as an actual legendary lord. When it comes to his faction, the the obvious route would be to select the Storm of Chaos name of the Sea Patrol. Most of the High Elf factions are named after kingdoms, but Aislinn has a rather unique situation as he comes from the same kingdom as Tyrion does. Both of them represent Etain, though obviously the Sea Lord is the naval branch. It could also be Lothern's Sea Patrol, perhaps, to add a bit more text, but it still has the same kind of issue in that Tyrion literally starts his campaign in Lothern itself. The Sea Patrol should be perfectly fine, in my opinion. His start location is the easiest one I've predicted in a hot minute, as Aislinn should of course start in the Eastern Colonies province at the Tower of the Sun. After all, the Sea Patrol's job is to sail the ocean routes across the world to allow Ulthuan to maintain its dominance of the sea. This will put him near some powerful friends and enemies, even though he'll be fairly isolated at the very start. Both Teclis and Cairo's Fateweaver war nearby to the southwest, and if my Slaanesh faction prediction video turns out to be true, there's a good chance T'Challa may be lurking quite close as well. To make his campaign have some spice early on, I would heavily recommend having the Tower of the Stars settlement controlled by an enemy Dark Elf faction that begins with a Black Arc and is harassing the minor faction of Tor Elisor in their settlement of the same name to give him some early intrigue to deal with in a faction he can confederate probably by doing a quick mission and yada yada. I also think it'd be worth adding one additional new settlement or region, if you want to put it that way, to the rather large island that the Tower of the Sun starts on, making this a 4-settlement province instead of the current 3, because that is just so much empty space that we could easily fill with something. Furthermore, I'd heavily recommend for CA to add more pirate factions to the oceans east of the Southlands, as things are starting to heat up in that area, and those rogue pirate factions make for excellent wandering enemies that can give great experience and rewards. Finally, the time is coming to really consider opening up some additional provinces along the coasts of both End and Koresh. While it won't be absolutely necessary, as Aislinn could be perfectly busy focusing his attention to the west, and a sea lane teleportation route could be added by End or Koresh that just allows him to pop closer to Cathay, it'd be nice to see some new territory. I will also note, I do think it'd be a great idea to also expand the Southern Chaos Wastes much further east, as the Southern Chaos Wastes are actually supposed to connect to that chunk of land, which is across that strait from the southern tip of Koresh, which is known as the Gates of Calith. So maybe that could be a focus for now, if they don't want to open the coast of End and Koresh yet. Just expanding the Southern Chaos Wastes, maybe be opening that little chunk that gets close to Koresh, because there's supposed to be a High Elf tower there as well. That would add in more potential Demon and Beastman factions, as well as giving Sea Lord Aislinn significantly more to do south of him rather than just west. Anyway, that's done. So let's discuss potential faction effects. Sea Lord Aislinn should definitely be one of the major naval powerhouses in the game, alongside the Vampire Coast, Lokir Felhart, Alberic de Bordelot, etc. I would have this best represented by notable buffs for his faction when fighting at sea and in port settlement battles, along with a notable campaign movement buff when in naval stances. So he moves much faster when on the ocean. Finally, I would have the Sea Patrol gain an advantage to what I hope will be a new mechanic for the High Elves that I'll call the Sea Lanes. Something similar to Cathay and the Chaos Dwarfs caravan mechanic, but the High Elf version, which should uniquely only travel by ocean to other famous ports in the world setting out from Lothern. Destinations that I would recommend off the top of my head, which we'll do a dedicated video talking about like mechanics and free LC changes for the various DLC factions. But places that I think the High Elves should be able to trade with are the port settlements of Skeggi, which I know it is a Norskin settlement, which you may think, oh, Norskins, bad guys. But Skeggi, despite its ill reputation, is well known for trading with all sorts of different people that come and go. So even though it starts as owned by a spooky chaos faction, I don't think that should disqualify it from being an interesting place that you can trade with. Just like if you are playing a campaign with Grand Cathay or the Chaos Dwarfs, you're able to trade with factions or into places that might not necessarily have sympathetic owners all of the time. In addition to Skeggi, I would recommend Arnheim, which for some reason in game is a Dark Elf starting settlement, even though Arnheim is literally a High Elf settlement. It is the only fortress, you could say, or settlement that the High Elves have managed to successfully build on the continent of Nagaroth. So I've never really been sure why it starts with High Elves instead of Dark Elves, or the other way around, Dark Elves instead of High Elves, but that should definitely be a destination you're allowed to trade to. Then you have, I would also recommend Erengrad over by Kislev, Salzenmund on the Northern Empire, Bordelot in Bretonia, Magrida in Astalia, Maragliano in Tilea, Badakvar, which is the dwarfs' only major port, the Fortress of Dawn, which is a fairly isolated, large, typically High Elf-owned colony, the Tower of the Sun, which is obviously where Aislinn would start and is another major colony, and then the Cathayan gigantic super major port of Fushao. So that would be the recommended list, which would give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, which I believe is fairly standard. I want to say Cathay has 10 trade options, and I think the Chaos Dwarfs have like 12 or 14. So that would have it fairly standard with Cathay and the Chaos Dwarfs. Looking at personal lord effects, Aislinn should have the shipbuilding mechanic of the Vampire Coast, which is something, frankly, I would also like to see given to Albrecht de Bordelot as well at bare minimum. So a colossal ship that he could construct buildings in to function as a pseudo-horde, though none of the other lords in his faction should benefit from it. It should be exclusive to him. He should also provide substantial buffs to units that have to do with the Lothern Sea Guard. So the Lothern Sea Guard, Lothern Skycutters, which we'll talk about later, Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers, Lothern Sea Helm Heroes, which we'll talk about later, and Merwryms, which we'll also talk about later. So those are the units that I think he should provide buffs to in his army, like maybe upkeep reduction and some other slight buff. The last section for the Sea Lord before moving on is what he should actually do in battles. This section is quite open to interpretation, as there is little lore on Aislinn's equipment. The only thing he's known for wielding is an Ithilmur blade or saber with enough skill to overwhelm Lokir Felhart until the Corsair Lord ended up using dirty tactics. So perhaps that could be a magic item for him, the sword that he used against Felhart that shattered into 3 pieces. Maybe his quest battle revolves around he has to find the 3 pieces and reforge them back together, Lord of the Rings style or something. Perhaps he could actually use a sword and shield combination, which would be fun, as that would, amusingly enough, make him the only High Elf legendary lord in the game to wield a shield. A skilled duelist, I do think he should have the Martial Mastery passive, and some active ability, probably called Master of the Mists, which was an ability he had in tabletop, to represent his enchanted mist that grants stalk and snipe to units he targets. So maybe like an individual unit target or an AoE with a good 200 meter range or so. And if he uses on that unit, they become stalked and sniped. So this would allow his bolt throwers and other ranged units to fire on the enemy from stealth without revealing themselves. The lore also discusses that Sea Lord Aislinn has an uncanny ability to summon Merwrms from the depths. So perhaps he could have a once per battle ability to summon one out. This one might need to be campaign exclusive though, as being able to summon a big monster is pretty crazy, generally speaking. Lastly, we have his mount options, which I would suggest a list of he can be on foot, he can ride a great eagle, and then last, he can ride a Lothern Skycutter. The Skycutter would grant him access to its bolter type shooting attack. As he's primarily a naval-focused character used to running around on ships, I'd avoid giving him horse or land chariot mounts, and I personally don't think it would be that appropriate for him to have a dragon or a griffin. I'm still really not a fan of the fact that Lokir Fellheart just randomly got given a dragon out of absolutely nowhere, but I don't think we should repeat that mistake. At long last, we have finished with Aislinn's section of the video, so let's move on to legendary heroes. For this part, we actually have the choice of two really kick-ass characters, though I will be making the argument that both of them should come in this DLC, or at least be released at the same time, for reasons that I will explain later. The first legendary hero I shall be presenting to all of you is the bodyguard of Phoenix King Finnebar himself, Korhil Lionmane. The legacy of Korhil has always been one of defending his fellow elves. Hailing from the outer kingdom of Thrace, the people of this forested land have always been of hardier stock than of other Asur, due to the dangerous predators and frequent assaults by Dark Elf raiders. It was one such band of Druki Reavers that would present young Korhil's first challenge, when the notorious Saurios Nightblade attacked his village. Despite his youth and inexperience in matters of war, Korhil had spent his entire life training alongside other Thracian hunters and foresters, men and women who were all expected to handle an ancestral great axe with expert finesse. Thus, when Saurios underestimated both the strength and speed of his foe, it resulted in his head parting from his neck. Nightblade had been a well-known menace for quite some time in Ulthuan, considered a master swordsman that had trained under assassins of Cain. This impressive accomplishment immediately earned the young lord an invitation to join the White Lions, the personal guard of Phoenix King Finnebar himself. To accept this incredible privilege, however, Korhil would need to complete the initiation ritual, to hunt and kill a Thracian lion by himself. Even before this opportunity had arisen, Korhil knew the beast he would pursue. The kingdom of Thrace had been terrorized in recent years by occasional attacks in the form of a warped monstrosity known as Charandis. Once a normal white lion, the creature had ventured too far into the Anuli Mountains and became twisted by the gusting winds of magic that scraped across its peaks. Already, dozens of hunters had been savaged by the beast, and many feared the massacre it would unleash should it come upon a village. Korhil ventured deep into the Thracian highlands in pursuit of the mutated lion, discovering its trail of destruction. Tracking Charandis proved easy, as it tore apart anything in its path. When Korhil caught up with the beast, he finally bore witness to the nightmarish change wrought upon it by the touch of chaos. Charandis had swollen in size, being far larger than other lions, and its hide transmuted into armor that no weapon could penetrate. Filled with bloodlust, the tormented creature launched itself at Korhil the second it became aware of him. The battle was incredibly fierce, but no matter how much might Korhil put behind his strikes, the hide of Charandis remained unscathed. Realizing that he would perish without a way to wound the beast, Korhil fled before the snapping maw and razor claws. Thinking quick, he led the lion on a frenzied chase through the mountains. Managing to dodge and parry to narrowly avoid evisceration, Korhil focused his effort on exhausting his foe. The on and off chase continued for days, as Korhil used all his cunning and skill as a forester to continuously lure Charandis further down the highlands and into the dense forests. When at last its fatigue began to show, Korhil dropped his weapon and tackled the creature, wrapping his arms around its throat He heaved with all his strength in a desperate attempt to strangle his foe. Charondas thrashed around upon the ground, but in a feat of strength unheard of for an elf, Korhil managed to throttle it until at last the mutated lion went still. With this success, Korhil had proven himself not only worthy of admittance to the White Lion's regiment, of which only 2 other elves in history had joined at such a young age, but also earned the name Lionmane. Phoenix King Finnebar himself ordered for the pelt of Charondas to be fashioned into a magnificent enchanted cloak in honor of the extraordinary achievement. From here, Korhil would spend several decades fighting alongside his fellow White Lions and earning their esteem against would-be assassins and terrible monsters. It would be in 2302 of the Imperial calendar that destiny would come calling, when Korhil stood upon Finneval Plain for the battle that would determine the fate of Ulthuan in the Great War against Chaos. Across the battlefield stood thousands of Dark Elves with their Chaos allies, united under the iron fist of Malekith. Before the battle truly began, the Witch King of Nagaroth sent forward his personal champion, Urien Poisonblade, who challenged any who would meet him to single combat. The second soul to meet this infamous assassin in battle was Cornhane Ironglaive, captain of the White Lions. While he put up a heroic effort, nonetheless, he fell before Urien's superior ability. Despair gripped Korhil to see a friend and mentor fall in such a brutal fashion, but he also witnessed the incredible turn of events when Prince Tyrion stepped forwards to avenge those who fell by piercing Urien's heart after an epic confrontation. Korhil fought in the ensuing battle, one of the bloodiest seen since the days of the Sundering. The High Elves ultimately won that day, and the remainder of the war, at great cost. In the aftermath, the White Lions met to select a new captain, swiftly deciding that Korhil Lionmane would be their choice. Approved and blessed by Finnebar himself, Captain Korhil received the weapon Chayal as a symbol of his new office. From here, Korhil would go on to protect the Phoenix King on numerous occasions, despite suffering grievous injury, such as the incident at the Battle of Tor Akare, when he hurled himself between Finnebar and Morik the Black's Manticore. He managed to disembowel the monster with a single sweep of his axe before collapsing unconscious from the mauling he received. In 2307 of the Imperial calendar, he also saved Finnebar from a squad of Cainite assassins that struck with such ferocity that the White Lions could only shield their charge with their bodies in the hopes of weathering the assault. Korhil's cloak proved up to the task, buying enough time that the assassins broke off their attack and attempted to flee. This led to a series of running battles across the rooftops of Lothern, as each of the assassins was slain, Korhil himself decapitating the leader Glorier Duskblade with a single swing of Chayal. Korhil's legacy stretches far beyond just his role as the Phoenix King's bodyguard, however, as he often requests leave so that he might answer the call of friends and allies that request aid. Rather unusual for an elf, the captain of the White Lions counts many among the other races that he considers friends. Humans, halflings, and even dwarfs have been fighting a seemingly impossible battle, only to see a familiar face as Korhil arrives upon his White Lion chariot to plow through hordes of enemies with regiments of Asur at his back. Normally, at this point, I cover end times lore as well, but Korhil's is rough, so I'll give a brief version of it. The poor guy essentially ends up being a close ally and friend to Tyrion that desperately tries to keep the defender of Ulthuan from falling into darkness. Sadly, he fails to convince Tyrion from giving into rage, but still remains by his side even when he draws the sword of Cain. This leads to a series of events that ends with Korhil attempting to steal the Widowmaker so that he could separate its corruption from Tyrion. But this scheme ultimately fails, and best boy Korhil is tortured to death by the one he tried to save. Well, lore's done, so let's move on to gameplay. Korhil is one of those legendary heroes that should be extremely geared towards protecting other characters. A strong melee fighter with a specialized focus into anti-infantry, as, fun fact, he's so damn big and muscular that he wields both his family heirloom great axe and the magical Chael with one hand each. They're both great axes, and he dual wields them anyway. He should be noticeably larger than the other high elf characters, as he is said to be the strongest elf in all of Ulthuan, in regards to just feats of strength, like actual physical strength, I should say. I'd see him having a high armor piercing damage with fairly balanced stats and the martial mastery passive. Furthermore, he should have the woodsman trait and a higher than expected leadership stat. Obviously, he should have an improved version of Guardian, perhaps granting more physical resistance than normal, or replacing it outright with a flat ward save bonus of some kind. He also bears the magical great axe that he wields one-handed, Chael, which translates to Lion's Claw. This should grant him a big fat bonus to his weapon damage stats as an active ability. Meanwhile, the Pelt of Tyrandus should give Korhil a passive buff that grants him immunity to contact effects and improved physical resistance. Finally, when it comes to mount options, he should have the options of being on foot or on his White Lion chariot. For his campaign stuff, I'd imagine Korhil having a trait that buffs War Lions, White Lion chariots, and White Lion units in his army. For his unlock quest, something standard perhaps, like recruiting a certain number of Kracian units and then getting a certain number of kills with said units. That seems to be kind of the standard affair these days. For the second legendary hero, we will come back to him in just a minute, after talking about the generic lord for reasons you will quickly figure out. There's only one true option left for the High Elves when it comes to new generic lords, which is, of course, the Anointed of Asuryan. These legendary warriors are the most elite among the Phoenix Guard, those elves who dedicate their lives in service to the Emperor of the Heavens, Asuryan. Sages who choose to immerse themselves in Asuryan's teachings, the Anointed spend much of their time meditating within the Chamber of Days, learning the lessons of past and future. When the course of destiny stands upon a tipping point, one of the Anointed will leave the shrine to bear witness on Asuryan's behalf. The arrival of an Anointed brings hope to the mortal children of the gods, for the King of the gods himself stands with them. Like their subordinate Phoenix Guard, the Anointed are bound by a vow of silence and never speak. But their very presence causes enemy spells to fail, and mundane weapons to shatter or turn aside inexplicably at the last moment. When the situation is truly dire, the Lords of Asuryan wordlessly summon to them one of the mighty phoenixes to ride into battle. In terms of gameplay, the Anointed of Asuryan are halberd-wielding melee fighters that should specialize in defensive support abilities. Their base profile should focus on having armor-piercing anti-large attacks, a niche currently missing from the generic Lords of the High Elves, with solid leadership, high melee defense, and around 100 starting armor. They should have all the base passives that the Phoenix Guard bring to bear, which includes expert charge defense, charge reflection, immune to psychology, causes fear, and martial mastery. Furthermore, they'll have the starting physical resistance of 30% to represent the Witness to Destiny special rule, in addition to a hefty spell resistance of 20 to 30% as they had magic resistance 2 in tabletop, which is quite high. Their main unique ability should be a passive aura called Blessings of Asuryan, which should grant immune to psychology and a 5 to maybe 10% physical resistance to allies within 30 to 55 meters. Alternatively, it could be an active ability instead, but if they do that, it should just grant a ward save buff to units within range instead of a physical resistance buff if it's a passive. Lastly, for their mount options, they have the ability to either be on foot or mounted on one of the Phoenix variants. In tabletop, they could only choose between the Flamespire and Frostheart Phoenixes, but due to the expanded roster of Total War, I think it'd be completely reasonable to allow them access to the Arcane Phoenix as well. This allows them to fill a nice niche, currently not provided by the normal Prince, Princess, and Archmage. I think the Anointed will make for a lovely new addition. Rather amusingly, the Anointed of Asuryan should also make for a cheaper lord than normal, as due to their vow of silence, they shouldn't have any voice acting whatsoever. That takes me to the second legendary hero I'll be discussing in this video, Caradryan, Captain of the Phoenix Guard. Before I explore his story, let's take this moment to talk about why I'm including him in this video alongside Korhil. Caradryan is a unique case for a legendary character, as with the exception of his death ability we'll discuss shortly, he also is bound by a vow of silence, and thus doesn't make any vocalizations. Furthermore, he's essentially the fancy version of the Anointed, and uses a unique Frostheart Phoenix mount. All that to say, Caradryan should be one of the easiest characters to implement for the game. He requires very little truly unique components, including a voice actor to only say a single line. I hope this means he can be included as a bonus within the DLC or perhaps a free LC, though it's also quite possible he might be added for like an event or at a later date. He doesn't necessarily have to release at the exact same time, though I do hope Creative Assembly would at least comment on it to kind of let us know. Anyway, let's discuss just who this elf is. An exceedingly arrogant prince of Etain in his youth, Caradryan was handsome, rich, powerful, and conceited. A living stereotype of the most jaded high elf aristocrat. There was no rumor he would not foster, no intrigue to which he would not stoop. So petty was he that his own family was said to despise him. His father would have cast him out, were it not for the fact that such an act would violate all tradition. All of this built up to when young Caradryan made a pilgrimage to the shrine of Asuryan on the Isle of Flame, a trip all nobles are expected to undertake once in their lives. In a supreme act of arrogance, the lordling gave in to his curiosity and snuck into the forbidden depths of the pyramid. Stealing into the holy chamber of days, Caradryan witnessed truths not meant for his naive mind, and found himself facing the wrathful gaze of Asuryan himself. The elf that emerged was a changed man. Upon his forehead blazed the rune of Asuryan for all to see. He had been marked as a servant of the Creator God. On that day, Caradryan gave up all his worldly possessions and took the vows of the Phoenix Guard. He has never uttered a word since. Caradryan spends long days in secluded meditation, reading the fiery letters upon the Chamber of Days that speak of past, present, and future. At other times, he stands upon the outer wall of the Shrine of Asuryan, scouring the lands of Ulthuan with a gaze that sees far beyond mortal possibility. Some among the Asur believe that no event is too small to evade his sight, no sound small enough to escape his hearing. Others accuse him of harnessing the prophecies of Asuryan to influence the future, a deep transgression against the Creator God that is considered one of the highest blasphemies possible. In truth, however, Caradryan simply notices things others do not, and refuses to be distracted by the paltry politics he once indulged in. In the early days of his service, like many elves, he found himself guided to the titanic struggle that was the Battle of Thinnaval Plain. Amongst the bloody warfare, Caradryan found his gaze drawn to a clash of monsters, as one of the mighty Flamespire phoenixes, Ashtari, came screeching down upon the black dragon Korhil. While the fury of Akshi burned through the noble bird's blood, it had chosen an ill-suited match in the ancient drake. Ashtari shrieked in agony when brought crashing to the ground beneath the dragon's superior might. Here he would have perished, but for the last moment, as Caradryan intervened and faced off with the cruel Druchi monster. Working together, the two managed to bring low Korhil. Ever since that day, Ashtari has remained a loyal friend and steed to his savior. Following this and long years of study and contemplation of Asuryan's truths, Caradryan has become closer to the thoughts of the Creator, until finally the Emperor of the Heavens marked him as captain of the Phoenix Guard in 2384 of the Imperial calendar, about 120 years before the modern timeline. Merwrym, the previous captain, stepped aside in accordance with Asuryan's will. Since then, Caradryan has acted as one of Ulthuan's greatest protectors, often arriving just in time upon Ashtari's back to turn the tide of ill-fated battles. For many decades now, the Phoenix's roaring flames have turned to freezing ice, as he's now the oldest living Phoenix. Together, they thwarted the Skaven's attempted invasion of Etain, preventing the Ratmen from securing a foothold upon Ulthuan, and many other notable feats. When the end times came upon the world, Caradryan played a critical role, as he revealed the will of Asuryan to see Malekith crowned as Phoenix King. He knew better than any that the final battle had truly come, for his prophesied death was averted. Interpreting this as an end to his vow, Caradryan spoke freely and helped lead the armies of those loyal to Asuryan against the Avatar of Cain. He survived the final civil war of the Elves, witnessing the destruction of Ulthuan itself, as it sank beneath the waves when the great vortex was unbound, the magic keeping it afloat dissipating. From here, he ventured to Lothern with the other survivors, joining the Council of Incarnates when he became one of them, the Wind of Akshi itself selecting him as its new host after the death of Ungrim Ironfist. The new Incarnate of Fire, he faced off with several terrible champions of Khorne until the end of the world itself. His most famous confrontation was the duel with none other than Arbal the Undefeated, one of the most powerful Khornate warriors to ever live. Their conflict was a furious display of martial perfection and blazing fury. But in the end, Caradryan just managed to decapitate Arbal after a brutal struggle. Exhausted and deeply wounded, when he found himself immediately faced with the wrath of Kabanda. While he managed to deal the Bloodthirster a wound so ruinous that it caused the demon to experience pain for the first time in its existence, ultimately, his efforts against Arbal proved too much. Both Caradryan and Ashtari fell to the greater demon, though Kabanda's triumph would be short-lived, as Sigmar Heldenhammer faced the monster with Gal Miraz shining in his grip. On to actual gameplay before I very quickly get into a hate rant towards Kabanda showing up again. Caradryan is essentially an Anointed of Asuryan with one extra ability and a built-in magic weapon. In tabletop, He was actually just a tiny bit worse than the standard Anointed, but this had more to do with balancing him out as a hero choice. In any event, he has all the bells and whistles that the standard Anointed do at the wonderful discount of only being a hero instead of being a lord. In addition, he has the Mark of Asuryan passive ability, which states that if Caradryan should be slain, he breaks his vow of silence to call out the secret words that will unleash the fury of Asuryan to avenge him. In game, this will probably be represented similar to the Curse passive on Tomb Kings. It's rather standard practice in Total War for these on-death character abilities to be changed to near death instead. So I expect something like, when his health falls below 20%, he'll unleash an AoE that deals significant damage to enemies caught within range. Caradryan also wields the Phoenix Blade, an ancient flame-wreathed blade that was enchanted for Korhil, the first captain of the Phoenix Guard. This halberd should have an active ability that grants flaming attacks, increases his weapon strength, and improved anti-large. Finally, Caradryan will have the mount options of being on foot or his unique Frostheart Phoenix, Ashtari. As for his unlock missions, the standard fare would be recruiting a certain number of Phoenix Guard or Phoenix units, then a follow-up mission of killing a certain number of enemy, yada yada yada. At long last, we're past the legendary characters, so let's head down to see what generic hero we have waiting for us. The one remaining choice is the Lothern Skyhelm, which is thematically perfect to go along with Sea Lord Aislinn. These brave warriors are the greatest heroes of Lothern, masters of wielding spear and bow while aboard tumultuous ships and flying skycutters. The skilled naval officers of Ulthuan's legendary fleets, the Skyhelms know best how to utilize the strengths of the Elves when fighting at sea or among the clouds. As one might expect from the officers among the Lothern Sea Guard, the Skyhelms wield spear and shield into battle, which will mark them as being the first shielded hero for the High Elves. They are lightly armored, but make up for it with excellent martial skill. They're better in close combat than the handmaidens of the Everqueen, but not as skilled in archery. When it comes to their representation in Total War, the Lothern Skyhelm should have the same armor as handmaidens at 40-ish, but superior melee attack and melee defense. Skyhelm weapon strength, leadership, wounds, etc. should mostly be the same as the handmaiden though. While his bow will also have the same range, it's a mundane weapon, so it'll deal less damage and have no flaming or magical effects as well. In addition to his superior combat stats, the Lothern Skyhelm also has a unique ability called Naval Discipline. This should be a passive ability that grants all allies within 35 meters immune to flanking and expert charge defense, to represent the Skyhelm's tabletop skill of expertly reforming regiments around him to prevent enemies getting off flank charges. Lastly, they have a unique ability called Windrunner, which is only active when the Skyhelm is mounted on the Lothern Skycutter. This should be an active ability that, when triggered, grants a solid ward save along with improved movement stats that allows them to maneuver better to avoid flying enemies. Alternatively, it could be just a passive ability that grants defensive buffs to the Skyhelm when enemy flying units are within 35 meters of him. For mounts, as you may have guessed due to the naming convention, the Lothern Skyhelm can either be on foot or Lothern Skycutters, which we'll discuss in a moment. Not able to ride a horse or anything else, it's just the Skycutter. That finishes us with the character section, which was starting to feel like it would go on forever. Anywho, what 5 units do I predict will arrive alongside the ruthless Sea Lord Aislinn? First up, and most obvious, is of course the Lothern Skycutters. These enchanted chariots float upon a cushion of magic, allowing them to perpetually remain airborne as they're pulled around by swift feather rocks. These majestic avians are native to the glittering coast around Lothern, only slightly smaller than great eagles, but no less deadly in combat. One beast is attached to each chariot, more than strong enough to pull it around at incredible speed. Within the body of the Skycutter can be found 3 Lothern Sea Guard, armed with spear and bow to harass enemies as they soar by. Furthermore, Skycutters can act as weapon platforms for an Eagle Eye Bolt Thrower, which is a slightly smaller variant to the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. These weapons are unable to use the volley alternative firing mode that the Eagle Claws can, but their single shot packs just as nasty of a punch. In Total War, these flying chariots should be in squads of 3, each having 3 Lothern Sea Guard aboard, with one on their Eagle Eye Bolt Thrower, while the other 2 use secondary ammo to fire their bows. They're likely to function quite similar to Scourge Runner Dark Elf chariots, with the exception that they fly, of course. A solid 80 armor, I think, with 90 plus speed to zip through the skies. Much better combat stats than horse-drawn chariots for the High Elves, but not quite as deadly as the White Lion chariot. This should provide a nice harassment unit to the High Elf roster that further cements their aerial dominance, while also granting a reasonably armored flyer perfect for slamming into vulnerable enemy infantry units along the back lines. Now, let's turn to the units that will be coming to Total War from the Storm of Chaos roster for the High Elf Sea Patrol. We'll start with the 2 infantry units. Alright, this one is a tad controversial, but hear me out. Lothern Sea Rangers. In tabletop, these guys were literally just Shadow Warriors, given a naval-themed name, as an actual Shadow Warrior unit traditionally hails from Nagaryth and doesn't tend to hang out on boats. As we already have 2 kinds of Shadow Warriors in game, we don't need a 3rd unit doing the exact same thing. So, my recommendation is that the Lothern Sea Rangers should be reworked into a cheap infantry unit that wields great weapons. Mirroring the regular Rangers that we already have, they should have skirmish formation, physical resistance, and vanguard deployment, but bring armor-piercing boarding axes or great swords or some kind of great weapon into the game. They should also trade out the woodsman rule that the regular Rangers have for the aquatic special rule. This would be quite helpful for the roster overall by allowing the White Lions to be boosted a bit more as a higher tier infantry armor-piercing unit, as they should be, rather than being forced down into a lower mid-tier, which currently is done to give the Asur a viable armor-piercing infantry unit. Overall, I think they'd offer a nice early game alternative that fills a much needed niche within the roster by giving the High Elves that cheaper armor-piercing infantry alternative without having to go all the way up to White Lions. The final infantry unit we'll be looking at for the High Elf DLC is, of course, the Ships Company. These reliable but low-tier warriors bring the tried and true equipment of sword and shield to the High Elf roster. Basically, they're just the High Elf equivalent to Dark Elf Bleak Swords. Exactly like their Druchii cousins, the Ships Company should cost the exact same as the High Elf Spearmen, but trade out the charge defense against large and charge reflection for notably improved damage, melee attack, and charge bonus. Though, of course, they'll also lose a bit of melee defense. This provides another nice, cheap infantry squad to diversify Asur options. The small fries, now, are all wrapped up. Time to move on to the big time. The big headliner that will beef up the High Elves is their new monstrous pal, the Merwrym. This dreadful leviathan is native to the dark abyss of the ocean, yet answers the call when the Asur cry out for aid. Said to be distant cousins to the dragons, the children of Ammonar are horrific beasts, more than capable of facing off against the mightiest monsters, whether on land or in the sea. Despite being classified as sea monsters, merworms can move with shocking speed in any environment, which many soldiers have discovered right before a very unfortunate death. The most well-known features of the merworm are its incredibly tough scales, powerful tail capable of shattering castle walls, and regenerating flesh. In Total War, the merworm should be a powerful melee combatant that adds the first non-flying monster to the High Elf roster. Well, excluding Alariel's Treeman, but that's cheating, so we're not going to count him. Of course, it'll have the obvious causes terror, high health pool, and should have quite high armor, reinforced by improved missile resistance due to its scaly skin. Since it's not a flying monster, it won't have to do the typical trade-off of said armor for that mobility, which tends to be how Total War handles that situation. Furthermore, the merworm actually had an impressively high combat skill for a beast, bringing much higher melee attack and defense than one might expect. I'd say something like 45-ish melee attack, maybe 50-ish melee defense. They are, however, a bit weaker in the leadership department compared to most high elf monsters, and much slower since they gotta walk around like peasants. Despite that, though, they're not slouches when it comes to speed, and can easily keep up with other chunky monsters, so your Stegodons, Stonehorns, and Hydras, for instance. Merworms also come packaged with regeneration, which is always a delightful ability. Then there's their powerful tail. This skill could be interpreted in several different ways, either by granting them the Wallbreaker trait, or perhaps an active ability where they slam down their tail, causing mass disruption and AoE damage around them. They should, of course, also have the Aquatic trait to gain some bonus stats when fighting in water. Now here's where things are going to get interesting, and I'm going to get a little spicy. There's actually 3 types of merworms. On the tabletop, you'd really just represent them with different color schemes because they're all the same size. But my proposal would be to give each of these 3 variants to a separate faction. The High Elves would receive the true merworm, which has the unique buff of poisoned attacks, which is an incredible ability in Total War. To the Dark Elves, I would have this DLC grant them the Pago Worm, a variant said to dwell in the frigid seas of Nagaroth. This subspecies of merworm isn't as skilled in combat as the High Elf variant, so lower melee attack and stuff like that, but makes up for it with the Enfeebling Cold ability. This grants the Pago Worm a passive aura that is very similar to the Blizzard aura found on the Frostheart Phoenix. So a 35-meter aura, perhaps, that lowers speed, charge speed, weapon strength, and melee attack. But as I mentioned, comes at the cost of melee attack, melee defense, and some other stats. Lastly, to the Vampire Coast, I would grant an undead Skeoworm. This version of the merworm hunts in the abyss of the ocean's deepest trenches. That crushing darkness becomes part of their very nature, granting the Skeoworm the ability Abyssal Cloak. This should be a passive buff that grants the Skeoworm much higher missile resistance and an AoE aura that lowers leadership to enemies within range. So, just to be clear, only the High Elf variant gets the poisoned attacks. Only the Dark Elf variant gets the Enfeebling Cold aura, and only the Vampire Coast gets the Abyssal Cloak passive. I always love when other factions benefit from new units. Why should only Chaos get all the fun? That brings us to the final unit for the High Elf portion of the DLC. For this, I have a bit of an unusual idea, but hear me out. Hear me out. When the various elven factions were designed, they were often intended to have various units that were reflections of one another. For instance, the Swordmasters versus the Hargoneth Executioners versus the Wildwood Rangers. One of the interesting parallels is the Sisters of Twilight and the Doomfire Warlocks. These are cavalry units with the ability to act as pseudo-wizards, wielding bound spells along with unique little gimmicks. I was always so disappointed that the High Elves got left out of this uniquely elven unit type, but now the time has come to fix that. The final unit is an interpretation of the last thing we'd be missing from the original High Elf Sea Patrol army list from the Storm of Chaos, which is the new wizard known as the Storm Weavers. On tabletop, they were literally just regular archmages, but they had 2 unique spells they could take. But let's do this instead. So, I propose a new unit, the Storm Weavers, a unit of warrior mages riding on swift feather rocks, a flying cavalry unit utilizing the new bird to tie them deeply into the theme of the Sea Patrol. Decent melee fighters with magical attacks that are extremely fast and excellent for sudden strikes on enemy units. They should have pretty damn low armor, but should have a passive that grants them high missile resistance when not in melee, called Conjured Mist, or maybe Enchanted Mist. Furthermore, for their 2 bound spells, they should have unique ones called the Writhing Mists and Mistress of the Deep, which were the 2 spells they got access to through the Storm of Chaos. The Writhing Mists should be an AoE buff that grants affected units improved melee defense and missile resistance as, quote, a salt-scented mist rolls in across the battlefield, shrouding the Asur with its ethereal caress, end quote. The Mistress of the Deep, on the other hand, should be an AoE debuff that causes enemies affected to gain the Feral Rage passive for a short time, meaning they'll rampage at the appropriate damage thresholds. The spell reads as follows. Even amidst the clamor of pitched battle, the enemies of the elves are distracted by the mind-twistingly haunting tones of the Oceanid's song, and beguiled by a vision of ominous beauty unique to each beholder, end quote. I realize that rampage effects are extremely powerful, but that would make this a higher tier unit and make the spell worth having. And as long as the ability lasts for a really short period of time, just, 5-7 seconds, it shouldn't be overpowered. Especially as the Storm Weavers would be reasonable melee combatants, but likely pretty damn lacking in the armor piercing department. Good size, good weapon strength, but very little AP. So they wouldn't trade well with enemy elite or upper mid-tier units. They're better for punishing like enemy wizards, enemy ranged units, or just low armor stuff. Whew! With that, we have arrived at the end of the High Elf Slaanesh DLC prediction video. I actually feel really good about this one, as I was able to slot in every single missing unit from the 8th edition army book and the Storm of Chaos roster, along with a bonus treat from the Monstrous Arcanum for the Dark Elves and the Vampire Coast, which would mean that the High Elves would be done. Like, they would be 100% done, outside of like really bizarre super old characters or like White Dwarf stuff. But as far as I'm concerned, and y'all know that I want everything, as I define it, I would, if we got all the things I talked about in this video, I would consider a big fat green check mark next to the High Elves as 100% done. Do not need another anything. Like, they're completely done. They don't need any free LC. They don't need any DLC. They're done. So long as their mechanics are all functioning properly. Anywho, my part in this is now over. So, now I'd like to hear what you think. Please share your thoughts on the various picks and explanations I have in the video. Did you enjoy the lore segments? How do you feel about Sea Lord Aislinn for the Legendary Lord? Do you prefer Korhil Lionmane for a bodyguard legendary hero so that CA would have to pay a voice actor? Or do you think instead we should only get Phoenix riding Caradryan? What about the various unit picks? Do you think the Lothern Sea Ranger should be brought in as a cheap great weapon unit? Do you think they should be made into something else? And tell me what you really think about the Storm Weavers. Love them, hate them, let me know. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. With this, we're going to be heading pretty heavily into 2025 now, as I think I actually finished this right before 2025, but I'm recording it now. And let's manifest the best possible version of this Slaanesh DLC. See you next time. Bye-bye.